August 30th, 1992. Reading Festival, England. 50,000 people packed into a muddy field waiting for Nirvana to take the stage. Most of them didn't expect the band to show up at all. The British music press had spent the entire summer of 1992 declaring Nirvana finished. Done. Over before they'd barely started. It began in July when Kurt Cobain collapsed backstage in Belfast during a European tour. The official story was exhaustion and dehydration, but the British tabloids smelled blood. They printed stories about drug addiction, about Kurt being on the verge of death, about the band falling apart from internal conflicts. Melody Maker ran a headline, Nirvana, the beginning of the end. NME published anonymous quotes from industry sources claiming Kurt had overdosed and was in a coma somewhere in Europe. Kerrang wrote a mock obituary disguised as a concert review, calling Nirvana's recent performances the death rattle of a band that burned too bright, too fast. The narrative was set. Nirvana was another cautionary tale, another band destroyed by sudden fame. Kurt Cobain was another tragic figure who couldn't handle the pressure. Reading Festival was supposed to be Nirvana's redemption, their chance to prove the press wrong. But as the date approached, the rumors intensified. Kurt had been seen in a wheelchair at an airport. Kurt couldn't play guitar anymore. Kurt was too sick to perform. The festival promoters were terrified. Nirvana was headlining the final night. If they canceled, the entire festival would be considered a failure. 3 days before reading, Kurt called the promoter from his hotel in London. "We're playing," Kurt said. His voice was quiet, tired. "Don't worry." "Are you sure you're well enough?" the promoter asked. "I'll be there." That was all Kurt said. Then he hung up. Backstage at Reading Festival on August 30th, the atmosphere was tense. Other bands who'd performed earlier in the day were hanging around, curious to see if Nirvana would actually appear, and if they did, what condition Kurt would be in. Members of Mudhoney were there. L7, the Melvins, Pavement, all the bands that represented the underground music scene Nirvana had emerged from. They knew Kurt personally. They were worried about him. Around 8 p.m., a van pulled up to the backstage area. Kurt got out first. He was in a wheelchair. He wore a hospital gown, the kind that ties in the back. His hair was messy, unwashed. He looked pale, sick, damaged. The few people who saw him arrive stood in shocked silence. This wasn't a joke. The rumors were true. Kurt was actually dying. Chris Novoselic, Nirvana's bassist, pushed the wheelchair toward the stage area. Dave Grohl, the drummer, walked behind them, carrying his drumsticks, his face unreadable. A festival medic approached. "Sir, do you need medical attention?" Kurt didn't respond. He stared straight ahead, expressionless. Chris kept pushing the wheelchair. They reached the side of the stage. The crowd of 50,000 people couldn't see them yet, but they could hear the roar of anticipation, the energy of thousands of people waiting, wondering if this would actually happen. A stagehand tried to help Kurt out of the wheelchair. "Don't touch me," Kurt said quietly. The stagehand stepped back. The festival's head of security came over. "Mr. Cobain, are you sure you want to do this? We can cancel. We can make an announcement. Nobody would blame you." Kurt looked at him for the first time. "I'm going on stage." His voice was soft but final. At 9:15 p.m., the stage lights went dark. The crowd noise reached a fever pitch. Then slowly a single spotlight came up. It illuminated Kurt Cobain being pushed onto the stage in a wheelchair, wearing a hospital gown, looking like he was moments away from death. The crowd went silent. 50,000 people, completely silent. You could hear the wind moving through the field. You could hear the distant sound of generators, but nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Kurt sat in the wheelchair, motionless, as Chris pushed him to center stage. The silence stretched. 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds. People in the front rows could see Kurt's face. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't acknowledging the crowd. He looked through them, past them, somewhere else entirely. Some people in the audience started to cry. This was real. Kurt Cobain was dying in front of them. Then slowly, Kurt reached up and pulled off the hospital gown. Underneath, he was wearing a t-shirt and jeans. He stood up from the wheelchair. The crowd erupted. Not applause, not cheering. A primal roar of relief and shock and joy and confusion, all mixed together into pure sound. Kurt walked to his microphone. He picked up his guitar, a battered Fender Jaguar covered in stickers. He slung it over his shoulder and adjusted the strap. He leaned into the microphone. "Hi," he said. "Just that. Nothing else." Then he turned to Dave Grohl and nodded. Dave counted off with his sticks. 1, 2, 3, 4. They exploded into Breed. The sound hit the crowd like a physical force. Kurt's guitar was loud, aggressive, perfect. His voice was strong, angry, alive. Dave's drums were thunder. Chris's bass shook the ground. This wasn't a sick man struggling through a performance. This was a band operating at full power, maybe even beyond full power, channeling months of frustration and anger into pure sonic energy. Kurt moved across the stage like he was possessed. He jumped, he thrashed. He fell to his knees and played without missing a note. He leaned back so far it seemed impossible he wouldn't fall over. The wheelchair sat empty at the side of the stage. A prop, a message, a middle finger to everyone who'd written him off. 3 songs in, Kurt stopped between songs and spoke to the crowd. "Thanks for the flowers, Uri," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Thanks for all the get-well-soon cards. Really thoughtful." The crowd laughed, but it was nervous laughter. They were still processing what was happening. "Especially thanks to the British music press," Kurt continued, "for caring so much about my health. Very touching." He didn't sound angry. He sounded amused, like he'd just pulled off the greatest prank in rock history. Because that's exactly what he'd done. The wheelchair entrance wasn't weakness. It was theater. It was Kurt taking all the rumors, all the morbid fascination with his supposed decline, and throwing it back in their faces. "You want me to be dying? Fine. I'll show you dying. Then I'll show you what I actually am." The performance continued for 90 minutes. They played songs from Nevermind. They played new material that would later appear on In Utero. They played covers of songs by the Vaselines and the Melvins, paying tribute to the underground bands that influenced them. Kurt's guitar playing was ferocious. Not technically perfect. It never was. But emotionally devastating. Every note sounded like it meant something, like it came from somewhere deep and real. During Lithium, Kurt sang the softest parts almost in a whisper, making 50,000 people strain to hear him. Then he'd explode into the chorus, screaming the words, his voice raw and unfiltered. During Smells Like Teen Spirit, the crowd sang so loud they drowned out the band. Kurt stopped playing halfway through and just watched them sing his words back to him. His expression was complicated, part gratitude, part discomfort, part wonder that this thing he'd created had become bigger than him. Near the end of the set, Kurt stopped and addressed the crowd again. "You know what's funny," he said. "When we were planning this festival appearance, I was actually sick. Really sick. The press wasn't completely wrong about that. I'd been in hospitals. I'd been struggling." The crowd got quiet again listening, and I thought about canceling. Thought about just staying home, letting them win, letting the story be Kurt Cobain was too weak to perform. But then I thought, fuck that. I'm not giving them that satisfaction. He paused. "So yeah, I showed up in a wheelchair. I showed up looking like shit, because that's what they expected. That's what they wanted. And then I stood up and played, because that's what I actually am, a guitar player, in a band, playing songs." He slung his guitar back over his shoulder. "This one's called Territorial Pissings." They launched into one of the most aggressive songs in their catalog. Kurt screamed the lyrics like he was exorcising demons. The crowd moshed violently, safely together. When the main set ended, the crowd chanted for an encore. Kurt came back alone, carrying an acoustic guitar. He sat on the edge of the stage, legs dangling over the side. "I'm going to play something quiet now," he said. "If you could shut up for a minute, that'd be great." 50,000 people fell silent. Kurt played All Apologies, a song that wouldn't be officially released for another year. It was the first time most of the crowd heard it. His voice was different on acoustic, more vulnerable, more melodic. The anger was gone, replaced by something sadder, more resigned. "What else should I be? All apologies. What else could I say? Everyone is gay." The lyrics made no sense and perfect sense simultaneously. That was Kurt's gift. writing words that felt deeply personal and completely universal at once. When he finished, he stood up, waved to the crowd, and walked off stage. No theatrics, no smashing guitars, no fire. Just a guy who'd played some songs and was now done. Backstage, the reaction was chaos. Musicians who'd watched the performance were stunned. Members of the British press who'd written the death rumors were scrambling to understand what just happened. Thurston Moore from Sonic Youth found Kurt backstage. "That was brilliant," Thurston said. "The wheelchair entrance, the whole thing. Fucking brilliant." Kurt shrugged. "Seemed funny at the time. You made them all look like idiots." "They made themselves look like idiots," Kurt replied. "I just helped them see it." A journalist from NME approached, trying to get a quote. Kurt ignored him completely, walking past like he didn't exist. Dave Grohl was sitting on an equipment case, still buzzed from the performance. "That was the best show we've ever played," Dave said to Chris. "Probably," Chris agreed. "Think it'll shut them up?" Dave asked. "The press?" Chris laughed. "For about a week. Then they'll find something else to write about." He was right, of course. The British music press couldn't be silenced for long. But for those few days after Reading Festival, they had nothing to say. Kurt had made his point too effectively. The performance became legendary immediately. People who were there told people who weren't. Bootleg videos circulated. The wheelchair entrance became iconic, an image representing Kurt's complicated relationship with fame, with expectation, with the media's hunger for tragedy. But the people who understood the performance best were other musicians. They recognized what Kurt had done. Eddie Vedder from Pearl Jam watched a bootleg of the performance a few weeks later. He and Kurt had a complicated relationship, mutual respect mixed with media-manufactured rivalry. After watching Reading, Eddie called Kurt. "That was the most punk rock thing I've ever seen," Eddie said. "What was?" Kurt asked. "The wheelchair. The whole setup. You punked the entire British music press." Kurt was quiet for a moment. "They wanted me to be dying," he finally said. "So I showed them dying. Then I showed them living. Figured that made the point better than any interview could." "It did," Eddie said. "Trust me, it did." Years later, after Kurt's death in 1994, the Reading Festival performance took on different meanings. Some people saw it as defiant victory. Others saw it as foreshadowing, Kurt literally performing his own death and resurrection. Music critics who'd written those summer 1992 rumors had to reckon with their role. Some apologized. Some doubled down, claiming they'd been partially right even if the timing was wrong. Most just moved on to the next band, the next story, the next rumor. Dave Grohl, in a 2001 interview, was asked about Reading Festival. "That night showed me who Kurt really was," Dave said. "Everyone thought he was fragile, broken, this tortured artist who couldn't handle the pressure. And yeah, he struggled. But he also had this core of steel. He could take everything they threw at him and throw it back harder." The interviewer asked, "Do you think the wheelchair entrance was healthy? Some people say it was Kurt romanticizing his own destruction." Dave shook his head. "That's exactly the kind of analysis Kurt was mocking. It wasn't romanticizing anything. It was mockery. Pure mockery. He was saying, 'You want me to be dying? Here's dying. Oh, wait, now I'm not dying. Now I'm playing music. Confused? Good.'" Chris Novoselic reflected on that night in a 2005 documentary. "The British press destroyed Kurt that summer," Chris said. "They built him up for 2 years, then tried to tear him down in 2 months. The wheelchair thing was Kurt taking control of the narrative. Instead of denying the rumors or defending himself, he embodied them, then transcended them. It was brilliant. Painful to watch sometimes, but brilliant." The interviewer asked if Kurt planned the wheelchair entrance in advance. "Sorta," Chris said. "We talked about doing something theatrical. Kurt had the wheelchair idea maybe 2 days before the show. We weren't sure if it would work or if it would backfire, but Kurt didn't care. He said, 'If they're going to write stories about me, I might as well give them a show.'" One of the most telling reflections came from a British music journalist named Stephen Wells, who'd written some of the harshest pieces about Nirvana that summer. In a 2012 retrospective for Louder Than War, he admitted, "I was at Reading that night. I'd written that Nirvana were finished. I'd compared them to a dying star, burning out in real time. When Kurt came out in that wheelchair, I thought I'd been right. For about 30 seconds, I felt vindicated. Then he stood up and started playing, and I realized he'd just made me look like a complete fool. Which I was. I'd mistaken vulnerability for weakness. I'd mistaken honesty about struggle for inability to function. Kurt taught me that night that you can be hurt and still be powerful. That lesson stuck with me. The Reading Festival performance became a dividing line. People who'd seen it or understood it gained a different perspective on Kurt Cobain. He wasn't a victim. He wasn't a passive recipient of fame's destructive power. He was an active participant in his own mythology, shaping it, commenting on it, subverting it. The wheelchair became a symbol, but not the symbol people expected. It didn't represent Kurt's weakness or decline. It represented his understanding of how image works, how media works, how expectation works, and his willingness to use those mechanisms for his own purposes. In the end, the Reading Festival '92 performance showed something essential about Kurt Cobain that many people missed while he was alive and only understood after he was gone. He wasn't destroyed by fame. He understood fame better than most people gave him credit for. He saw through the machinery of celebrity, the narratives, the hunger for tragedy. And for one night in an English field in front of 50,000 people, he pulled back the curtain and showed everyone exactly how it worked. Then he played his guitar and sang his songs because that's what he actually was. A musician. Everything else was theater. The British press declared Nirvana dead. Kurt Cobain showed up in a wheelchair to agree with them. Then he stood up and played the most powerful set of his career. What happened next changed how everyone understood him. But by then, he'd already made his point, and the 50,000 people who were there would never forget it.